The CEO of Riverside General Hospital walked out of the emergency board meeting believing he had won, and then he looked out the 14th floor window and saw the parking structure, the main entrance, the ambulance bay, and every road within half a mile completely consumed by an ocean of chrome and black leather that stretched further. Then his eye could follow, and he understood immediately and completely that he had made the last catastrophic mistake of his professional life. 200 motorcycles, 200 men who had ridden through the night from 4 different states, who had eaten gas station food and slept in 2-hour rotations in the back seats of support vehicles, who had not complained once, who had not needed to be asked twice, who had simply been told that there was a woman in a city called Barstow, California, who had given everything she had to save one of their own without knowing who he was, and that the people responsible for destroying her life were inside that building, behind that glass, on that 14th floor right now. Martin Halse pressed one hand against the window. His reflection stared back at him, 61 years old, $3,000 suit, a man who had spent 22 years learning how institutions protect themselves from the people they hurt, and for the first time in 22 years, he felt the specific, absolute terror of understanding that none of that knowledge was going to help him today. But to understand why 200 Hell's Angels descended on a single hospital in the high desert of California on a Thursday morning in October, we have to go back 7 months back to a Tuesday night in March, when a woman named Diana Reeves sat in a parking lot in her 11-year-old Honda and cried for 40 minutes before she drove home to make dinner for her children. Barstow, California sits at the edge of the Mojave Desert like something the rest of the state forgot to bring with it. The air smells of hot asphalt and creosote and the particular dryness that settles into the back of your throat and stays there. In summer, the heat is a physical weight. In winter, the wind comes off the desert floor. With an edge like cold steel, the town is not pretty. It has never tried to be. It is a place where people work at the railroad, at the logistics centers along the freeway, at the fast food restaurants and gas stations, and the single regional hospital that serves this stretch of the desert and the small towns bleeding off it in every direction. Riverside General Hospital stood on the east side of town, a 12-story concrete structure with a glass atrium entrance and a parking structure that charged $4 an hour, and a gleaming new administrative wing that had been completed 2 years earlier at a cost of $6 million while the was operating with a nursing staff that was 11 positions below recommended capacity. Diana Reeves had worked inside that building for 16 years. She had started at 22, fresh out of nursing school, still carrying the specific idealism of someone who had chosen this work on purpose, who had looked at the range of things a person could do with their life and had said deliberately, "I want to be the one standing next to the person who is most afraid." She had worked the emergency department for all 16 of those years. She knew every hallway, every supply closet, every attending physician's verbal shorthand, every quirk of the triage system. She had held the hands of people who died and the hands of people who didn't, and she had never once confused the two experiences or let one harden her to the other. She was 38 years old. She had 2 children, Marcus, 11, and Caleb, 7. She raised them alone. Their father had left when Caleb was 18 months old and had not been reliably present since, financially or otherwise. Diana had built her life with what she had, her salary, her competence, her absolute refusal to allow the financial pressure of single parenthood to translate into self-pity. She got up at 5:30 every morning. She packed lunches. She helped with homework at the kitchen table after 12-hour shifts with her scrubs still on. She kept a detailed budget in a spiral notebook, not on her phone, not on a spreadsheet, in an actual paper notebook in blue ink, because writing the numbers down by hand made her feel like she was in control of them. She was not a woman who asked for help. She was not a woman who complained. She was, in the specific and undervalued way of people who hold things together without acknowledgement, extraordinary. In January of that year, 2 things happened that would change everything. The first thing, Riverside General's billing department, under pressure from the hospital's executive team, began submitting modified diagnostic codes on a systematic basis to maximize Medicare reimbursements. The scheme was not subtle, not to anyone paying attention. Procedures that had been billed at standard rates were being rebilled at higher complexity codes. Patients who had received routine care were appearing in the billing system as having received intensive interventions. The dollar amounts involved were not incidental. The CFO's internal memos, which would not become public until much later, referenced a target of $14 million in enhanced reimbursements over an 18-month period. Martin Halse, the hospital's CEO, had signed off on the framework in a meeting attended by 4 people, none of whom were physicians or nurses or anyone whose primary function was the care of patients. The second thing, Caleb Reeves, Diana's 7-year-old son, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. He had been tired for weeks, then thirsty, always thirsty, a thirst that seemed almost desperate, a child drinking glass after glass of water and still asking for more. Then the weight loss. Diana had recognized the trajectory before the pediatrician confirmed it, because she was a nurse and because some knowledge, once you carry it, becomes impossible not to apply to the people you love most. She had sat in the pediatrician's office with Caleb on her lap and absorbed the confirmation of what she already suspected with the composed stillness of a woman managing her terror in real time. She had asked the right questions. She had taken the pamphlets. She had driven home and parked in the driveway and sat there for 15 minutes before going inside because she needed those 15 minutes to be afraid before she could be useful. Type 1 diabetes in a child is manageable. It is also relentless and expensive. The insulin Caleb required, the specific formulation his endocrinologist prescribed for a 7-year-old's particular metabolic profile, cost, without insurance, $340 per month at the pharmacy closest to their apartment. With Diana's hospital health insurance, her share had been $60 a month. $60 was manageable. $60 fit inside the spiral notebook. $340 did not fit anywhere. It consumed the grocery margin. It consumed the emergency cushion. It sat in the budget like a stone. In February, Diana was approached by the head of billing, a man named Craig Pelliter, who asked her to sign off on a set of patient records that had already been modified to reflect higher acuity care than had actually been delivered. He framed it as routine, a correction, a clarification, an alignment of documentation with what the hospital's billing requirements needed. He was not aggressive about it. He was casual, even in the way that people are casual when they have done something many times before without consequence. Diana read the records. She compared them against the actual patient charts she remembered. She handed the folder back to Craig Pelliter and told him she would not sign anything that did not accurately reflect the care that was delivered. Craig Pelliter nodded pleasantly and left. 3 days later, he came back with the same request. Diana gave him the same answer. On the last day of February, she was called into a meeting with her nursing supervisor and the hospital's head of human resources and a woman from the legal department whose presence Diana understood immediately was not incidental. She was told that her performance reviews over the preceding quarter had identified concerns about her clinical judgment and her ability to function cooperatively within the hospital's administrative systems. She was told that this was being documented as a formal written warning. She was given a form to sign acknowledging receipt of the warning. She did not sign it. She asked for the specific performance data the warning was based on. She was told it would be provided to her in writing within 10 business days. It was never provided. On the 14th of March, a Tuesday, Diana Reeves was terminated from her position at Riverside General Hospital. 16 years of service, not a single prior disciplinary action in her file. The termination letter cited ongoing performance concerns and a documented failure to meet the hospital's administrative standards. It was written in the specific language of people who have done this carefully, who have constructed a paper record designed to withstand scrutiny, who understand exactly how much documentation is required to make an unjust termination look procedurally clean. She was also informed, in a separate communication she received 3 days later, that the hospital had filed a complaint with the California Board of Registered Nursing citing concerns about her clinical judgment and professional conduct. The complaint contained specific allegations. The allegations were false, but a complaint filed with a state licensing board is not dismissed automatically, and a nurse whose license is under investigation cannot be hired by another medical facility until the investigation is resolved, and investigations of this nature do not resolve quickly. Diana's attorney, a legal aid attorney she could not actually afford, told her it could take 8 to 14 months. 8 to 14 months. She sat with that number in the parking lot of her own apartment complex and did the math in her spiral notebook. Her severance was 6 weeks of salary. Her unemployment would cover approximately 60% of her previous income. Caleb's insulin, without health insurance, was $340 a month. Marcus needed a new winter coat. The car registration was due. The utility bill from January still had an outstanding balance because the previous month had been tight and she had prioritized food. She cried for 40 minutes. Then she dried her face, went upstairs, made chicken and rice for dinner, and told her sons they were going on an adventure, that Mom was going to be trying some new things for a while, and that was actually exciting. Marcus, 11, looked at her with the specific perceptive gravity of a child who understands more than he is being told, and said nothing. Caleb ate his chicken and asked if they could watch television. By the end of March, Diana was working double shifts at a gas station on the south end of Barstow. The gas station was a quick stop, open 24 hours, attached to a small convenience store that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and the synthetic sweetness of packaged pastries. The overnight shifts paid $1.50 more per hour. She worked them when she could get her neighbor, Mrs. Florescu, to stay with the boys. Mrs. Florescu was 67 years old and asked for nothing in return except that Diana bring her a cup of the gas station's coffee when she came home in the morning, and Diana did this without fail. The coffee was terrible, and Diana brought it faithfully. She worked, she budgeted, she managed. She did not stop managing even on the days when managing felt like holding a structure together with her bare hands, while the structure continued silently to come apart. Caleb's insulin cost $340 a month. She paid it every month. She did not miss a dose, not once. The 9th of October was a Wednesday. The temperature in Barstow had dropped overnight from the residual heat of summer into the specific bite of a high desert autumn, not cold yet, not the cold that would come in November, but carrying the reminder that cold was coming, that the warm margin was ending. Diana was working the day shift at the quick stop, 7 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, because Mrs. Florescu had her niece visiting and couldn't take the overnight, and a day shift was better than no shift. She had Caleb's weekly insulin supply in her bag, 1 pen, the last of this week's budget, because she had picked it up from the pharmacy on her way to work and hadn't had time to go home first. She kept it in the insulated pouch she carried everywhere since his diagnosis, the small neoprene case with the zipper that she checked instinctively every 20 minutes, the way some people check their phones. The quick stop was quiet in the mid-morning. A trucker had come through at 8 for coffee and a breakfast sandwich. A teenager had bought an energy drink and left without making eye contact. The lottery machine had jammed briefly, and Diana had unjammed it by hitting it in the specific place she had learned it needed to be hit. The morning had the texture of mornings that are going to be uneventful, and Diana had the particular practiced efficiency of someone who fills uneventful time with the invisible labor of thinking, running the week's budget, calculating when the next utility bill was due, tracking Caleb's last glucose reading against the time of his breakfast. She heard the motorcycle before she saw it, a deep, unmistakable wind rumble that broke the quiet of the parking lot and then went irregular, stuttering, uneven, and then stopped. She looked up through the plate glass window and saw the bike pulled sideways into a spot near the air pump, and she saw the man climbing off it with the specific imprecision of someone whose coordination is compromised. He was large, enormously large, 6'4", 250 pounds of the specific physical density that comes from a life of physical work, broad across the shoulders, thick-necked, forearms like structural components. He was wearing a leather vest over a flannel shirt, and Diana was close enough, and the morning was clear enough that she could see the patches on the vest without being able to read them from inside. He walked from the bike to the front of the building with the deliberate, careful steps of a man concentrating very hard on making his legs do what he wanted them to do. He pushed through the door. The bell above it chimed. Diana looked at his face. She had been a nurse for 16 years. She had seen diabetic shock in every stage of its progression, from the early indicators that most people miss to the advanced presentations that become emergencies in minutes. She recognized what she was looking at before she had consciously processed it: the pallor under his weathered skin, the fine sheen of perspiration that had nothing to do with exertion, the slightly unfocused quality of his eyes, the way his jaw was working slightly even though he wasn't speaking, the tremor in his right hand that he was trying to control and not quite managing. She was already coming around the counter. "Hey," she said, not loudly, evenly, the tone she used in the air when she needed someone to hear her without being frightened. "Hey, look at me for a second." He looked at her. His eyes found her face and steadied slightly. "When did you eat last?" He started to answer. What came out was not quite a sentence. His speech was slurred in the specific way of hypoglycemia, not alcohol, not fatigue, a different impairment entirely, one Diana's nervous system recognized at a cellular level. She had one hand on his arm, guiding him toward the stool behind the counter, and she was all ready. scanning the store with the other part of her mind, already calculating regular soda, fast sugar. But she could see the sweat was heavier than mild. She could see the tremor was getting worse. He needed more than orange juice. He needed insulin correction. She thought about the pen in her bag. She thought about the arithmetic 1 pen, 7 days of Caleb's doses. She thought about it in the time it takes to complete 1 breath, which was all the time she had. She reached into her bag. "Sit down," she told him. "Right here. Don't argue with me." He sat. The stool creaked under his weight. He was breathing deliberately, like a man who knows something is wrong and is managing it through will, which was helping and also not sufficient. Diana retrieved the insulin pen from the insulated case. She told him clearly what she was going to do because she always told patients what she was going to do before she did it, and she administered the correction dose with the precision of someone who has done this 10,000 times because she had done it something close to 10,000 times. She kept her hand on his wrist. She watched his color. She watched his eyes. She went to the cooler and got a regular Coke, not diet, not the kind he might have otherwise reached for, and opened it and put it in his hands and told him to drink it and not stop drinking it until she said so. She watched him drink. She watched the tremor begin to slow. She watched his focus return to his eyes the way light returns to a room when someone finds the switch. He sat on that stool for 90 minutes. Diana stayed close. She monitored. She brought him a second Coke, and then, when he was stable enough to eat, a packaged peanut butter cracker from the rack near the register that she paid for out of her own pocket without thinking about it. She asked him when he was coherent enough to answer how long he had been on the road, whether he carried a glucometer, whether he knew when his last meal had been. He answered in the gradually clearing voice of a man coming back from the edge of something. His name was Roy. He was 54 years old. He had been riding since before dawn, had misjudged his food timing, had felt the onset indicators 30 miles back, and had made the calculation that he could make it to the next stop. It was the kind of decision that people who live with diabetes make and occasionally miscalculate. He had miscalculated. He was not, he told her, someone who usually miscalculated. She believed him. He had the bearing of someone for whom this was a genuine anomaly, not reckless, not cavalier, just human. Just the specific human error of estimating wrong. When he was fully stable, when Diana was certain, with clinical certainty, not just impression, she let herself exhale. She went back to her place behind the counter. Roy stood up slowly, testing his legs, finding them solid. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was hard to read on a face that appeared to have a long history of not displaying things easily. He reached for his wallet. "Please let me know," Diana said. "You used your own supply. I can see the case." He had seen it. Of course he had seen it. He did not appear to be a man who missed things. "Whatever that cost, whatever the dose was, I want to cover it." Diana looked at him. She thought about the spiral notebook. She thought about next week. She thought about Caleb and the specific weight of a mother's arithmetic and the number 340. "My son has enough to get through the next few days," she said. "We're fine. Please don't worry about it." Roy looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, the slow, deliberate nod of a man who has heard something and is filing it somewhere important. He asked her name. She told him. He told her his. They shook hands, his grip enormous, careful, the grip of someone calibrating force, and he walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He turned back. "I'm going to remember this," he said. Diana was already writing something on the shift log. She looked up briefly. "Drive safe," she said. "Eat something real before you get back on that bike." Roy Briggs walked out into the October morning, started his motorcycle, the sound of it clean and even now, steady as a heartbeat, and pulled out of the quick-stop parking lot. Diana watched him go. She did not know his last name. She did not know what the patches on his vest said. She did not know that Roy Briggs was the vice president of the Barstow chapter of the HellsAngels motorcycle club, that he had been a patched member for 26 years, that he was known in 3 states for a specific combination of qualities: ferocity, judgment, and a particular form of loyalty that operated more like a law of physics than a personal choice. She did not know any of this. She reached into her bag and checked the insulated case. The pen was gone. She had 7 days to figure out the next one. She opened the spiral notebook. She started doing the math. Roy Briggs did not go home immediately. He stopped at a diner 8 miles east of Barstow and ate a real meal, the kind she had told him to eat, eggs and toast and black coffee, and he sat with it for a while. He sat with the morning. He sat with the specific sensation of having nearly lost control of something fundamental about his own body, and the counter sensation of having been pulled back from that edge by someone who had acted without hesitation and without asking for anything in return. He was not a sentimental man. 26 years in the club had not produced sentimentality. But Roy Briggs had a code, a genuine one, not performed and not situational, and one of its core articles was this: when someone gives you something real, you recognize it, you don't let it pass unmarked, you don't accept it as ordinary and move on. He paid for his meal, he sat for another 10 minutes drinking his coffee, then he made a phone call. The call was to his chapter president, a man named Dale Cortez, who had been running the Barstow chapter for 11 years and who had the particular patience of someone who has learned that most situations reveal themselves completely if you let them. Roy told him what had happened, not the full situation, not yet, just the core of it, that a woman at the quick stop on the south end of town had recognized his symptoms, pulled him back from a bad place, used her own insulin supply to do it, and refused any payment. Dale listened without interrupting. When Roy finished, Dale said 2 words: find out. Roy found out. It did not take long. Barstow is not a large city. The quick stop's day shift was not hard to identify. A woman named Diana Reeves, 38 years old, former nurse at Riverside General. Roy made 3 phone calls. By the time he was driving back toward town that afternoon, he had the outline of her situation. He sat with that for longer than he had sat with anything in a while. And her nurse with 16 years of service, fired after refusing to falsify Medicare billing records. A state nursing board complaint that appeared to have been filed not because there was genuine concern about her clinical conduct, but because it would prevent her from being employed at another medical facility. A 7-year-old son with type 1 diabetes, the insulin cost without insurance, the gas station job, the double overnight shifts. She had given him the last pen she had. She had told him her son had enough for the next few days. She had lied. Roy Briggs made one more phone call. This one was longer. This one was not to the chapter president. Roy had to contact a man named Patrick Halse, who was not a member of the club but who had been in the club's legal orbit for 15 years and who was the kind of attorney that most people never need and some people need very badly. Patrick Halse had a particular professional specialty: institutions that believed themselves insulated from consequence. He had spent 15 years demonstrating case by case that insulation of this kind was largely a matter of whether anyone with resources and motivation had bothered to look closely. He was very good at looking closely. Roy explained the situation. Patrick Halse asked for questions. Then he said he would need 2 weeks. He needed 11 days. What Patrick Halse found, working with a forensic billing specialist and a former CMS investigator who now operated as a private consultant, was a Medicare fraud operation of significant scale and considerable deliberateness. It was not a rounding error. It was not aggressive billing interpretation. It was systematic diagnostic code manipulation across multiple service lines, generating what the consultant estimated at between $12 and $16 million in fraudulent reimbursements over a 26-month period. There were internal emails. There were billing modification logs. There were records of specific nurses and physicians who had been approached and asked to sign off on altered documentation, and records of what had happened to the ones who had refused. Diana Reeves was not the first. She was the 6th. 3 of the others had simply moved away. One had accepted a small settlement and signed a non-disclosure agreement. One was currently in a protracted legal battle that had consumed 2 years of his life and most of his savings. Diana was the 6th, and she was the only one against whom the hospital had filed a state licensing board complaint, which Patrick Halse read as an escalation, a message, an attempt to ensure that this particular nurse would not only lose her job but lose her profession. Martin Halse had done this carefully. He had constructed a paper record. He had used the hospital's legal department. He had used the billing department. He had used the HR department. He had used every institutional mechanism available to him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned, over 22 years, exactly how much institutional weight is required to crush one person. He had not accounted for Roy Briggs sitting in a diner 8 miles outside Barstow with a cup of coffee and a code. Patrick Halse compiled the documentation into a package. It was not a short package. It was the kind of package that, when presented to the right people, tends to produce rapid and decisive action. He sent a copy to Roy. He kept copies in 3 separate secure locations. He prepared a supplementary briefing for the FBI's Sacramento field office, which had an active healthcare fraud unit. He also prepared, separately, a targeted civil litigation threat specifically addressing the nursing board complaint which, if the underlying Medicare fraud evidence was accurate, had been filed in bad faith for the purpose of preventing a whistleblower from being employed, which was both civilly actionable and potentially criminally relevant. Roy brought all of this to Dale Cortez. Dale read it. He read it slowly, the way he read everything, without rushing toward a conclusion. When he was finished, he set the papers down on the table between them. He looked at Roy. She used her kid's insulin, Roy said. I know what she did, Dale said. Silence between them. The specific silence of 2 men who have known each other long enough that silence communicates things that words are redundant for. How many chapters can we reach in 48 hours? Roy said. Dale Cortez leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Roy Briggs, and something in his expression settled into a particular kind of stillness that the people who knew him well recognized as the moment before something irreversible was set in motion. All of them, Dale said. The calls went out on a Tuesday evening. Not texts, not emails, calls direct, personal, chapter president to chapter president, with Roy Briggs on some of them and Dale Cortez on others, and the message was the same in every conversation. A woman in Barstow gave everything she had for one of ours without asking who he was. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his patch. She saw a man in trouble and she used the last thing she had, and then she lied so he wouldn't feel guilty about it. And the people who destroyed her life are still sitting in that building, and we know exactly what they did, and we're going to be in that parking lot Thursday morning at 9 a.m. The chapter presidents heard the story. Then they made their own calls. By midnight Tuesday, 14 chapter presidents had confirmed. By 2 in the morning, it was 22. The calls moved through the network with the specific velocity of information traveling through a structure built on trust, not the slow percolation of rumor, not the noise-degraded spread of something past secondhand, but the clean transmission of a message moving between people who knew exactly what the message meant and had already decided what their answer was before the call ended. By Wednesday morning, it was 200 confirmed. 200 fully patched members, not prospects, not hang-arounds. Members, people who had earned their patches and carried what those patches meant as an actual daily lived weight. They were coming from Barstow, from San Bernardino, from Fresno, from Sacramento, from the Bay Area, from San Diego. They were coming from Las Vegas, from Phoenix, from Tucson, from Reno. They were riding their own motorcycles, or they were getting in cars and driving through the night, or they were doing both, alternating, covering ground. Not one of them had met Diana Reeves. Not one of them needed to have met her. She had given Roy Briggs her son's insulin and told him her son had enough to get through the next few days. That was the whole of it. That was all of it. And in the specific moral arithmetic of the people now converging on Barstow from across the western United States, that act, that particular, costly, quietly heroic act, was more than sufficient. They began arriving Wednesday night. The early arrivals, the ones from San Bernardino and the closer reaches of the valley, rolled into Barstow after midnight, the thunder of their bikes breaking the desert quiet in waves. They filled the parking lot of a truck stop on the north end of town. More came at 2 in the morning, more at 4. By the time the sun broke over the Mojave and painted the high desert in amber and copper, there were 140 motorcycles in that parking lot and the surrounding lots and the adjacent street, and the number was still climbing. By 7:30 Thursday morning, there were 200. 200 motorcycles lined up in an formation that the truck stop's overnight manager, a quiet, observant man named Leonard, who had been working this job for 19 years and believed he had seen everything the high desert had to offer, said looked less like a gathering and more like an army preparing to demonstrate the meaning of the word patience. They were not loud. They were not disruptive. They were waiting with the absolute, deliberate stillness of people who have decided exactly what is going to happen today and are simply waiting for the correct moment to begin. At 8:45, Dale Cortez made a call to Patrick Halse. At 8:50, Patrick Halse called the administrative office of Riverside General Hospital and asked to be connected to the office of CEO Martin Halse. He was told that Mr. Halse was in a board meeting and could not be interrupted. Patrick Halse identified himself by name and said, clearly and without elaboration, that he was calling on behalf of clients who were currently present in the hospital's vicinity, that he had a documentation package ready to be delivered to the FBI's Sacramento field office and the California Department of Justice's Healthcare Fraud Division and the CMS Office of Inspector General simultaneously, and that Mr. Halse had 1 hour to return. His call before that package was filed. He left his number. He thanked the administrative assistant. He ended the call. At 9 a.m., Dale Cortez raised his hand. 200 engines started. The sound of 200 V-twin motorcycles starting simultaneously in a truck stop parking lot in the high desert is not a sound that permits indifference. It is a physical event. It moves through the chest. It moves through the ground. It carries in it a register of intention that communicates itself below the level of language. In the part of the nervous system that evolved specifically to recognize when something very large and very powerful is moving in a coordinated direction. They moved in formation, down the main road, through the center of Barstow, past the diner and the courthouse and the gas stations and the small businesses opening their doors into the October morning. People stopped on sidewalks, people stepped out of shops, a school bus pulled over and a row of elementary school faces appeared at the windows, wide-eyed and perfectly still, watching the column of leather and chrome roll past with the serene, unstoppable gravity of something inevitable. They turned on to the hospital access road. They filled the main parking structure. They filled the surface lots. They filled the ambulance bay approach, not blocking it, deliberately not blocking it, because these were men who understood the difference between a display of force and an obstruction of emergency care, and they filled every accessible road in the hospitals. Immediate vicinity until the building stood at the center of an unbroken ring of motorcycles and men that extended in every direction as far as the eye could reach. 200 men, standing still, looking at a glass building, not threatening, not violent, not breaking a single ordinance, just present, just absolutely, completely, unmistakably present. Martin Halse saw them from the 14th floor. He had been in the board meeting since 8 a.m., discussing the quarterly financials, and he had walked to the window during a break because someone on the board had said something about noise in the parking lot, and he had looked out, and then he had not moved for 63 seconds, which his CFO, standing 3 feet away later, described as the longest 63 seconds of his professional life. His phone rang. His assistant, Patrick Halse, on hold, the documentation package, the FBI, the OIG, the California Dodge. Martin Halse looked at the parking lot. He looked at the ambulance bay. He looked at the access road. He looked at the perimeter of his building, which was no longer just a building but a building inside a ring of 200 men who had ridden from across the western United States because of what he had done to one woman. He picked up the phone. The conversation between Martin Halse and Patrick Halse lasted 37 minutes. Halse's own attorney arrived at the hospital by car 22 minutes into the call. Halse's attorney spent 7 minutes reviewing the documentation package that Patrick Halse had transmitted electronically. Then Halse's attorney told his client, in the specific, careful language of a lawyer speaking directly and for the record, that the documentation was substantial, that it was credible, and that the question was no longer whether the authorities would be notified, but rather the specific terms under which the hospital's cooperation with subsequent investigations would be recorded. In other words, this was over. The only question was how it ended. Martin Halse, to no one's great surprise, chose to cooperate. The calls went out on a Tuesday evening. Not texts, not emails, calls direct, personal, chapter president to chapter president, with Roy Briggs on some of them and Dale Cortez on others, and the message was the same in every conversation. A woman in Barstow gave everything she had for one of ours without asking who he was. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his patch. She saw a man in trouble and she used the last thing she had, and then she lied so he wouldn't feel guilty about it. And the people who destroyed her life are still sitting in that building, and we know exactly what they did, and we're going to be in that parking lot Thursday morning at 9 a.m. The chapter presidents heard the story. Then they made their own calls. By midnight Tuesday, 14 chapter presidents had confirmed. By 2 in the morning, it was 22. The calls moved through the network with a specific velocity of information traveling through a structure built on trust, not the slow percolation of rumor, not the noise-degraded spread of something past secondhand, but the clean transmission of a message moving between people who knew exactly what the message meant and had already decided what their answer was before the call ended. By Wednesday morning, it was 200 confirmed. 200 fully patched members. not prospects, not hang-arounds, members, people who had earned their patches and carried what those patches meant as an actual daily lived weight. They were coming from Barstow, from San Bernardino, from Fresno, from Sacramento, from the Bay Area, from San Diego. They were coming from Las Vegas, from Phoenix, from Tucson, from Reno. They were riding their own motorcycles, or they were getting in cars and driving through the night, or they were doing both, alternating, covering ground. Not one of them had met Diana Reeves. Not one of them needed to have met her. She had given Roy Briggs her son's insulin and told him her son had enough to get through the next few days. That was the whole of it. That was all of it. And in the specific moral arithmetic of the people now converging on Barstow from across the Western United States, that particular, costly, quietly heroic act was more than sufficient. They began arriving Wednesday night. The early arrivals, the ones from San Bernardino and the closer reaches of the valley, rolled into Barstow after midnight, the thunder of their bikes breaking the desert quiet in waves. They filled the parking lot of a truck stop on the north end of town. More came at 2 in the morning, more at 4. By the time the sun broke over the Mojave and painted the high desert in amber and copper, there were 140 motorcycles in that parking lot and the surrounding lots and the adjacent street, and the number was still climbing. By 7:30 Thursday morning, there were 200 motorcycles lined up in an formation that the truck stop's overnight manager, a quiet, observant man named Leonard, who had been working this job for 19 years and believed he had seen everything the high desert had to offer, said looked less like a gathering and more like an army preparing to demonstrate the meaning of the word patience. They were not loud. They were not disruptive. They were waiting with the absolute, deliberate stillness of people who have decided exactly what is going to happen today and are simply waiting for the correct moment to begin. At 8:45, Dale Cortez made a call to Patrick O'Say. At 8:50, Patrick O'Say called the administrative office of Riverside General Hospital and asked to be connected to the office of CEO Martin Halse. He was told that Mr. Halse was in a board meeting and could not be interrupted. Patrick O'Say identified himself by name and said, clearly and without elaboration, that he was calling on behalf of clients who were currently present in the hospital's vicinity, that he had a documentation package ready to be delivered to the FBI's Sacramento field office and the California Department of Justice's Healthcare Fraud Division and the CMS Office of Inspector General simultaneously, and that Mr. Halse had 1 hour to return his call before that package was filed. He left his number. He thanked the administrative assistant. He ended the call. At 9 a.m., Dale Cortez raised his hand. 200 engines started. The sound of 200 V-twin motorcycles starting simultaneously in a truck stop parking lot in the high desert is not a sound that permits indifference. It is a physical event. It moves through the chest. It moves through the ground. It carries in it a register of intention that communicates itself below the level of language. In the part of the nervous system that evolved specifically to recognize when something very large and very powerful is moving in a coordinated direction. They moved in formation, down the main road, through the center of Barstow, past the diner and the courthouse and the gas stations and the small businesses opening their doors into the October morning. People stopped on sidewalks. People stepped out of shops. A school bus pulled over and a row of elementary school faces appeared at the windows, wide-eyed and perfectly still, watching the column of leather and chrome roll past with the serene, unstoppable gravity of something inevitable. They turned onto the hospital access road. They filled the main parking structure. They filled the surface lots. They filled the ambulance bay approach, not blocking it, deliberately not blocking it, because these were men who understood the difference between a display of force and an obstruction of emergency care, and they filled every accessible road in the hospital's immediate vicinity until the building stood at the center of an unbroken ring of motorcycles and men that extended in every direction as far as the eye could reach. 200 men, standing still, looking at a glass building, not threatening, not violent, not breaking a single ordinance, just present, just absolutely, completely, unmistakably present. Martin Halse saw them from the 14th floor. He had been in the board meeting since 8 a.m., discussing the quarterly financials, and he had walked to the window during a break because someone on the board had said something about noise in the parking lot, and he had looked out, and then he had not moved for 63 seconds, which his CFO, standing 3 feet away, later described as the longest 63 seconds of his professional life. His phone rang. His assistant, Patrick O'Say, on hold, the documentation package, the FBI, the OIG, the California Dodge. Martin Halse looked at the parking lot. He looked at the ambulance bay. He looked at the access road. He looked at the perimeter of his building, which was no longer just a building but a building inside a ring of 200 men who had ridden from across the western United States because of what he had done to one woman. He picked up the phone. The conversation between Martin Halse and Patrick Halse lasted 37 minutes. Halse's own attorney arrived at the hospital by car 22 minutes into the call. Halse's attorney spent 7 minutes reviewing the documentation package that Patrick Halse had transmitted electronically. Then Halse's attorney told his client, in the specific, careful language of a lawyer speaking directly and for the record, that the documentation was substantial, that it was credible, and that the question was no longer whether the authorities would be notified but rather the specific terms under which the hospital's cooperation with subsequent investigations would be recorded. In other words, this was over. The only question was how it ended. Martin Halse, to no one's great surprise, chose to cooperate. What happened next did not happen all at once. Justice rarely does. It comes in stages, in increments, in the slow procedural grind of institutions accounting for themselves, and then, sometimes, in moments that are fast and final and feel, to the people watching them, like the world briefly and correctly realigning. The FBI's Sacramento Healthcare Fraud Unit received Patrick Halse's documentation package that Thursday afternoon. They had, as it turned out, already had Riverside General in a preliminary file. There had been a prior tip, an unrelated audit flag, a loose thread they had not yet pulled. Patrick Halse's package was not a thread. It was a rope. It was 14 months of forensic billing analysis, internal emails with timestamps, modification logs with names attached, and sworn statements from 2 of the 5 previously terminated nurses who had been waiting 2 years for someone with resources to give them a reason to stop being silent. The formal investigation was opened within 72 hours. The indictment took 4 months, 14 counts, Medicare fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 2 counts related to the retaliatory termination of whistleblower employees. The indictment named Martin Halse specifically. It named the CFO. It named Craig Pelliter. It named a member of the hospital's legal team who had drafted the nursing board complaint with documented knowledge of its false basis. Martin Halse surrendered himself to federal authorities on a Thursday morning. He was 61 years old and wore a suit that cost $3,000 and walked into the federal building in Sacramento with the specific bearing of a man who has spent his entire adult life believing himself categorically exempt from this kind of mourning. He was processed, he was photographed, he was fingerprinted, he was released on bail pending trial. His bail was set at $2 million. He did not look at cameras. His attorney made a brief statement outside the building. Nobody in Barstow watched it. The nursing board complaint against Diana Reeves was withdrawn within 2 weeks of the FBI investigation opening. The withdrawal was not voluntary in any meaningful sense. Patrick Halse had filed a civil action against the hospital and its legal team on the specific grounds of malicious filing and the board's own preliminary review had, once the Medicare fraud context was provided, rapidly concluded that the complaint was retaliatory and procedurally deficient. It was withdrawn with a notation that no finding of clinical impropriety had been made. Diana's license was clear. She got the letter on a Friday afternoon. She was standing in the kitchen making dinner. She read it twice. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, and she opened the spiral notebook, and she crossed out the line item she had been carrying for 8 months, the legal aid retainer, the board response filings, the cost of the ongoing uncertainty, and she sat there for a while with the crossing out, with what it meant. Marcus came in from the living room and found her sitting there. "Mom?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm really good, actually." He looked at her with the same perceptive gravity he had carried since he was small. Then he came and sat next to her at the kitchen table, and he didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Diana's reinstatement at Riverside General took longer. The hospital's new interim administration, brought in by the board after Halse's suspension, was navigating significant internal disruption, and the reinstatement process involved HR review and nursing department coordination and the specific institutional slowness of a large organization trying to correct something it would have preferred not to have to correct. But it happened. Full reinstatement, full benefits, back pay covering 8 months of the salary differential between her nursing income and her gas station income. The number the HR department put in the letter was the largest single figure Diana had ever seen on a document with her name at the top. She read it standing over the kitchen counter. She had to read it 3 times to believe it. Roy Briggs came to the quick stop one more time. He came alone on a weekday morning, in the same flannel shirt under the same leather vest, and he pulled into the same spot near the air pump. He came in and sat on the stool at the counter. Diana was working. She looked at him and did not say anything for a moment. "You doing all right?" she asked. "Better than I was," he said. "Good." She poured him a cup of the terrible coffee. "The food here hasn't improved. I'll manage." He accepted the coffee. He held it for a moment. "There's something else. The boys wanted to do something specific, and I couldn't talk them out of it." He set an envelope on the counter. Diana looked at it. She didn't pick it up. "Roy, it's not charity," he said. His voice was even and very direct. "Nobody in the club gives charity. What it is, it's a practical arrangement. A fund for Caleb's medication costs, specific to that, for as long as he needs it." He paused. "That's a long time. That's the rest of his life, probably. We know that. We've accounted for it." Diana was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't do what I did so that something would come back to me," she said. "I know that," Roy said. "That's why we're doing it." She looked at him. He looked at her. In the silence between them was the specific weight of 2 people who understood that something had happened between them that was larger than either of them had intended, and that the only honest response to it was to receive it without deflecting. She picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. Not yet. She set it carefully on the shelf behind the counter, next to the spare receipt tape and the manager's logbook. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," Roy said. He finished the coffee. He paid for it $1.75, which he left on the counter in exact change, which she suspected he had prepared. Before coming in, he stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned back. "One more thing," he said. "There's a position open at Desert Valley Medical Department. Nursing manager was asking around for recommendations." His expression was entirely neutral. "I happened to hear about it." Diana looked at him. "I'm not going to take a job because nobody said anything about why the position exists. You're qualified." He held her gaze for a moment. "You've been qualified for about 20 years. He walked out into the October morning because it was October again, because a year had turned and started his motorcycle, and the sound of it was clean and even and steady, and he pulled out of the quick-stop parking lot for the last time. Diana stood at the counter. She reached behind her and picked up the envelope. She held it in both hands without opening it for a long moment, feeling the specific gravity of it, not just the weight of what was inside, but the weight of what it represented, the weight of being seen, the weight of a gesture that cost something real, offered by people who did not have to offer it, in return for something she had done without thinking because it was simply, obviously, the right thing to do. She opened the spiral notebook. She crossed out the insulin line item entirely. She sat there for a while with the crossing out. Martin Halse was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with a fine of $3.4 million in restitution and a lifetime ban from any administrative role in the healthcare industry. His CFO received a separate sentence of 5 years. Craig Pelliter, who cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge, received 2 years of supervised release and a significant financial penalty. The hospital's legal counsel, who had drafted the nursing board complaint, was referred to the California State Bar for disciplinary proceedings. Riverside General Hospital entered into a consent agreement with CMS requiring the repayment of $9.2 million in fraudulent reimbursements plus a 5-year period of enhanced federal oversight. The hospital's board removed all senior administrative staff who had been present during the fraud period. The new CEO, hired from outside the institution, sent Diana Reeves a personal written apology on hospital letterhead. She kept the letter in the spiral notebook. Not because she needed it, because it was accurate. Diana Reeves accepted the position at Desert Valley Medical on a Tuesday morning, 16 months after she had last worn scrubs to work. She drove to the hospital in her 11-year-old Honda, which now ran significantly better than it had a year ago, because someone had quietly arranged for it to be serviced while it sat in the hospital parking lot on a Thursday in October, a detail she had not discovered until 3 days later and which had made her stand in her driveway for a moment with her hand over her mouth, and she parked in the staff lot and walked through the main entrance. The automatic doors opened. The smell hit her, antiseptic and floor cleaner and the particular institutional air of a hospital, and something in her chest that had been closed for 16 months opened. She was home. She walked to the nursing station. She introduced herself. The charge nurse on duty looked at her, a woman in her late 40s named Angela, who had the specific watchful competence of someone who has run difficult departments for a long time, and said, "We've been waiting for you." Diana hung her ID badge on her lanyard. She picked up a chart. She went to work. Caleb Reeves turned 8 years old in November. His birthday party had 11 guests, 9 of them his school friends, one of them Mrs. Florescu, and one of them Roy Briggs, who arrived in a car without the motorcycle, carrying a wrapped present that turned out to be a remote control truck of considerable scale and the specific excess that Diana would have expected from someone who did not have much experience buying presents for 8-year-olds but had tried sincerely. Caleb was delighted by it. He ran it into the baseboard twice within the first 10 minutes and did not apologize, and Roy watched this with an expression that was as close to delight as Diana suspected that particular face was capable of getting. Diana cut the cake. She gave Roy a piece. He sat at her kitchen table in a house that no longer felt like a place under threat, in a life that no longer felt like a structure she was holding together with her bare hands, and he ate the cake, and the room was loud with children, and Marcus sat across the table watching Roy with the careful attention of a child taking inventory of something, and after a while Roy looked at him and said, "You've got your mother's eyes." Marcus considered this. "Is that good?" "Best thing in the room," Roy said. Marcus nodded slowly, as though filing this alongside several other observations he had made and not yet voiced. Then he ate his cake. There is a particular kind of courage that never announces itself. It does not ask to be acknowledged. It does not perform. It does not calculate whether what it is about to give will be returned or recognized or even noticed. It simply acts because the situation requires action, because someone needs what it has, because turning away would require a specific kind of surrender that certain people are constitutionally incapable of making. Diana Reeves had been that kind of courage on a Wednesday morning in October when a large man walked through a gas station door and she saw in his face what he needed and she gave it to him without hesitation and without condition. She could not have known what would happen next. She could not have known that the man she helped carried the weight of an entire network of loyalty behind him, that her one act of giving would move through that network like a current, that 200 people would ride through the night because of a woman they had never met, because of an 8-year-old boy with type 1 diabetes, because of a spiral notebook and a line item crossed out, and a person who had been doing the right thing for 16 years without anyone watching. She could not have known any of that. She did it anyway. That is the point. That has always been the point. If this story reached something in you, if you felt what Diana felt, or what Roy felt, or what it means when 200 people ride through the night for a stranger's act of grace, then stay with that feeling for one more moment. Hit the like button. Not for the algorithm, because this story deserved to be told, and you know it. Leave a comment. Tell us the moment that got you. Was it the insulin pen? Was it the spiral notebook? Was it 200 engines starting at 9 a.m. on a Thursday? Tell us. We read everyone. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that courage doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like. Sometimes it looks like a woman behind a gas station counter reaching into her bag. Subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because they matter, because somewhere between the noise and the cynicism, there are people living with a code, people giving without calculating, people who understand that the only real currency is what you do when nobody's watching and you have every reason not to. Hit the notification bell so the next story finds you. We'll see you there.